The music pulsed through the air like a living heartbeat, reverberating off the marble walls of the grand estate. Chandeliers sparkled above the crowd, their light reflecting off crystal glasses and sequined gowns. This wasn't just a party, it was the event of the season, where the city's wealthiest and most powerful gathered to flaunt their status. The sprawling mansion, with its manicured gardens and glowing pool, was a testament to excess, a playground for the elite. Mabel, 24, moved through the crowd with practiced precision, her tray of champagne flutes balanced effortlessly in her hands. She wore the standard black and white uniform of the catering staff, but even that couldn't hide the exhaustion etched into her features. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes darted around the room, avoiding the gazes of the guests. She wasn't here to be noticed. In fact, she preferred to remain invisible. For Mabel, this wasn't just another catering gig, it was survival. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and her younger brother Ethan was still in school. Someone had to keep the family afloat, and that someone was her. She had grown used to the divide between herself and the people she served. The rich laughed, the servers worked, and the line between them was as sharp as the edge of a knife. But tonight, that line would blur in a way she never expected. As Mabel weaved through the crowd, the laughter and chatter around her felt distant, like a world she could never belong to. She caught snippets of conversations, stock market deals, luxury vacations, designer brands. It was a language she didn't speak, a life she couldn't imagine. Her grip on the tray tightened as she approached the poolside, where a group of guests had gathered. Among them was Damon, a man whose arrogance was as loud as the music. He leaned casually against a marble column, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. His smirk was sharp, his voice louder than anyone else's. Mabel didn't like working events where Damon was present. He had a way of making everyone around him feel small, and tonight, she had a sinking feeling that she would be his next target. The pool shimmered under the glow of string lights, its surface reflecting the opulence of the night. Mabel approached cautiously, her tray steady despite the slick tiles beneath her feet. The laughter of the crowd grew louder as she neared, and her stomach tightened. Damon was at the center of it all, his voice cutting through the music like a blade. "Hey, everyone," Damon called out, raising his glass high. His grin widened as his eyes landed on Mabel. "Who's up for a little fun?" Mabel's heart sank. She kept her head down, hoping to pass by unnoticed, but Damon stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Don't be shy," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're part of the party too, aren't you?" The group around him chuckled, their laughter sharp and cruel. Mabel forced a polite smile, the kind she had perfected over years of working these events. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, trying to step around him. But Damon wasn't done. Without warning, he reached out and shoved her shoulder. The motion was quick, almost casual, but it was enough. Mabel's feet slipped on the wet tiles, and the tray tilted in her hands. Time seemed to slow as the champagne flutes toppled, their golden liquid catching the light like falling stars. And then, the cold. The icy water of the pool engulfed her, stealing the breath from her lungs. For a moment, all she could hear was the muffled roar of the water in her ears. She kicked her legs, breaking the surface with a gasp, her hair plastered to her face and her uniform clinging awkwardly to her body. Above her, the world erupted in laughter. Mabel blinked the water from her eyes, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The crowd had gathered at the edge of the pool, their faces alight with amusement, and there, front and center, was Damon, his grin as sharp as ever. "Relax, sweetheart," he jeered, raising his glass in mock celebration. "It's just a little water." The laughter around him grew louder, and Mabel's hands clenched into fists beneath the surface of the pool. Every instinct screamed at her to lash out, to yell, to cry, but she didn't. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she swam to the edge of the pool and climbed out, her soaked shoes squelching against the tiles. Her hands trembled as she bent down to pick up the shattered glass from the tray. The cold wasn't what made her shake. It was the effort it took to hold herself together. "Look at her," someone whispered behind her. Does she even belong here? She should have stayed in the kitchen, another voice added, followed by more laughter. Mabel's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She focused on the task in front of her, gathering the shards of glass with deliberate care. Her dignity, though battered, remained intact. But then, as she reached for the last piece of glass, the laughter stopped. The air shifted, the chatter fading into an uneasy silence. Mabel didn't look up at first, but she felt it, the weight of someone's presence, cutting through the crowd like a blade. When she finally glanced up, she saw him. James Caldwell, the enigmatic host of the evening, stood at the edge of the crowd. His tailored suit seemed to shimmer under the lights, and his sharp blue eyes swept the scene with a cold, assessing gaze. The guests around him seemed to shrink under his scrutiny, their earlier amusement replaced with discomfort. "What's going on here?" James's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a steel that promised consequences. Damon, caught off guard, let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, just a little fun, James. No big deal." James's gaze flicked to Mabel, who was still on her knees, holding the tray of broken glass. His expression darkened. "This," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone, "looks like more than just fun." Mabel froze, her hands still clutching the broken shards of glass. The weight of James Caldwell's gaze was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. There was something in his expression, sharp, calculating, and yet, beneath it all, a flicker of concern. "Did you fall?" James asked, his voice steady but firm. Mabel hesitated, glancing at Damon, who was now shifting uncomfortably. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy. She could feel the tension in the air, the crowd waiting for her response. "No," she said finally, her voice quiet but unwavering. "He pushed me." The silence that followed was deafening. James's jaw tightened, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he turned to Damon. "You pushed her?" Damon raised his hands defensively, his laugh forced and hollow. "It was just a joke, James. Everyone thought it was funny, right?" He glanced around the crowd, searching for support, but no one spoke. The earlier laughter had evaporated, leaving only awkward silence. James took a step closer to Damon, his presence towering and unyielding. "Humiliating someone who works hard to make a living is your idea of a joke?" Damon opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You're leaving, now." Before Damon could protest, two men in black suits appeared at James's signal. They flanked Damon, their expressions unreadable but firm. "Wait, James, come on," Damon sputtered, his voice rising in desperation. "You're overreacting. It was nothing." James didn't even look at him. "Escort him out," he said coldly. The guards grabbed Damon by the arms, and the crowd parted as they led him away. His protests grew fainter as he disappeared through the gates, leaving behind an uneasy quiet. James turned back to Mabel, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentler now. Mabel nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice wavered slightly. "You don't look fine," James said, his eyes scanning her drenched figure. "Come with me." Mabel hesitated, glancing at the broken glass still scattered on the ground. "I still have work to do," she said quietly. James raised an eyebrow. "I think you've done more than enough tonight." He extended a hand, and after a brief pause, Mabel took it. His grip was firm but warm, and as he helped her to her feet, she felt a strange sense of relief. The crowd watched in silence as James led her away from the pool, their whispers starting up again as soon as they were out of earshot. Mabel kept her head down, her wet shoes squelching against the marble floors as they walked through the mansion. James guided her into a quiet lounge tucked away from the noise of the party. The room was dimly lit, the air cooler and calmer. A fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the plush leather furniture. "Sit," James said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. Mabel hesitated, feeling out of place in her soaked uniform, but James's expression left no room for argument. She sat down carefully, her wet clothes sticking uncomfortably to her skin. James poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter and handed it to her. "I don't drink," Mabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's apple juice," James replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Mabel blinked, then accepted the glass with a quiet, "Thank you." As she sipped, James settled into the chair opposite her, studying her with an intensity that made her squirm. His sharp eyes seemed to see straight through her, and for a moment she felt completely exposed. "You work hard," he said finally, leaning forward slightly. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself. The precision, the pride, even when the world around you treats you as if you're invisible." Mabel stared at him, unsure how to respond. "Tell me," James continued, his voice low and steady, "what drives you? Why do you endure this?" Mabel hesitated, the warmth of the juice in her hands steadying her nerves. Finally she spoke. "My family," she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "My mother's sick, and my brother is still in school. Someone has to keep things going, and that someone is me." James's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Your resilience is remarkable," he said. "But let me ask you this. Do you think these sacrifices will lead to the life you want?" Mabel's throat tightened. "It's not about what I want," she said quietly. "It's about what my family needs." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "And what happens when you burn out? When there's nothing left of you to give?" His words hit harder than she expected, and she looked down, her grip tightening around the glass. "I don't have a choice," she whispered. "There's always a choice," James said softly. "Sometimes it's just hidden beneath layers of expectation and fear." The fire crackled softly in the background, filling the silence between them. Mabel stared into her glass of apple juice, her mind racing. James Caldwell's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. She didn't know what to make of him. He was nothing like the other wealthy people she had encountered, arrogant, dismissive, and cruel. There was something different about him, something that made her feel both uneasy and strangely safe. "I don't mean to pry," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, measured. "But I see potential in you, Mabel, and I don't think you belong in a place where people like Damon can treat you like that." Mabel looked up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I run a foundation," he began. "We focus on community outreach, education, and providing opportunities for people who've been overlooked or underestimated. People like you." Mabel blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Me?" "Yes, you," James said firmly. "I've seen how you handle yourself tonight. Even after what happened, you didn't lash out. You didn't crumble. You kept your composure, even when you had every right to walk away. That kind of strength is rare." Mabel shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Strength? I don't feel strong. I feel tired. All the time." James's expression softened. "That's exactly why I'm offering you this opportunity. You shouldn't have to carry everything on your own." Mabel stared at him, her heart pounding. What kind of opportunity? James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black folder. He placed it on the table between them and slid it toward her. "Take a look," he said. Mabel hesitated before picking up the folder. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a series of documents. At the top of the first page was the name of James's foundation, the Caldwell Initiative. The words blurred slightly as she skimmed the text. It outlined a position, an entry-level role in the foundation's community outreach program. The salary was more than she had ever dreamed of earning, and the benefits included health insurance, something her family desperately needed. This can't be real," Mabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's very real," James replied. "I'm offering you a job, Mabel, a chance to step out of this cycle, and build something better for yourself and your family." Mabel's hands tightened around the folder. "Why me?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "You don't even know me." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I know enough. I know you're hardworking, resilient, and selfless, and I know that people like Damon will never see your worth. But I do?" Mabel's throat tightened, and she looked away, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. This was everything she had ever wanted, a way out, a chance to provide for her family without sacrificing herself in the process. But it also felt too good to be true. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. James didn't flinch. "There's no catch," he said simply. "The only thing I ask is that you give it your all. I don't hand out opportunities lightly, Mabel. I believe in investing in people who can make a difference, and I believe you're one of those people." Mabel's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but years of struggle had taught her to be cautious. Nothing in life came without a price. I need time to think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his expression understanding. "Of course, take all the time you need." He stood, smoothing out his suit jacket. "But let me say this, Mabel. You deserve more than what life has given you so far, and if you're willing to take a chance, I think you'll find that you're capable of far more than you realize." Mabel watched as he walked to the door, pausing before he left. "I'll have my assistant send you the details," he said. "And if you decide to accept, you know where to find me." With that, he was gone, leaving Mabel alone in the quiet room. She stared down at the folder in her lap, her mind racing. This was it, the chance she had been waiting for. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Her thoughts drifted to her mother, lying in bed at home, and her younger brother, who still had so many dreams ahead of him. This wasn't just about her. It was about them. Mabel closed the folder and took a deep breath. She didn't have an answer yet, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same. The bus ride home was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional chatter of passengers. Mabel sat by the window, the black folder clutched tightly in her lap. The city lights blurred as the bus sped through the streets, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the night over and over again. James Caldwell's words echoed in her head, "You deserve more than what life has given you so far." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that someone like her, a waitress, a nobody, could have a chance at something better. But the doubts crept in, as they always did. What if this was a mistake? What if she wasn't good enough? What if... The bus came to a stop, and Mabel stepped off, the cool night air hitting her like a wave. She walked the familiar path to her small apartment, her footsteps heavy with uncertainty. The building was old, the paint peeling from the walls, but it was home. Inside, the dim light of a single lamp illuminated the living room. Her mother, Sarah, was asleep on the worn-out couch, a blanket pulled up to her chin. The soft sound of her breathing filled the room, and Mabel felt a pang of guilt. Her mother had been a nurse once, strong and full of life, but the illness had taken so much from her. Her health, her independence, her joy. Now, Mabel was the one holding everything together, working long hours to pay for the medication and treatments that kept her mother stable. She set the folder down on the small kitchen table and walked over to her mother, gently tucking the blanket around her. "Good night, Mom," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's face. In the next room, her younger brother Ethan was hunched over his desk, scribbling furiously in a notebook. He was only 16, but he carried himself with a quiet determination that reminded Mabel of their father, who had passed away years ago. "Still studying?" Mabel asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan looked up, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Yeah, I've got a big test tomorrow." Mabel smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're going to do great. You always do." Ethan's gaze shifted to the folder in her hands. "What's that?" Mabel hesitated, then walked over and placed it on the desk in front of him. It's An opportunity, she said slowly. Ethan opened the folder, his eyes widening as he skimmed the documents. This is amazing, Mabel. Are you going to take it? I don't know, she admitted, sinking into the chair beside him. It's a lot to think about. What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess it up? Ethan frowned, closing the folder and turning to face her. You're the strongest person I know, he said firmly. You've been taking care of us for years, Mabel. If anyone deserves this, it's you. Mabel felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked away, blinking back tears. It's not just about me, she said quietly. What if it doesn't work out? What if I can't take care of you and Mom anymore? Ethan reached out and took her hand, his grip steady and reassuring. You've already done so much for us. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself, too. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so long putting everyone else first that the idea of doing something for herself felt almost selfish. But was it? Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Mabel thought about the life she wanted for her family, a life where her mother didn't have to worry about medical bills, a life where Ethan could go to college without the weight of debt on his shoulders. And maybe, just maybe, a life where she didn't have to feel invisible anymore. She reached over to the nightstand and picked up the folder, flipping through the pages once more. The words blurred slightly as tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear. For the first time in a long time, Mabel allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by struggle, a future where she could be more than just a waitress. She closed the folder and took a deep breath. The decision wasn't easy, but deep down, she already knew what she had to do. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the small apartment. Mabel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple white shirt and a pair of black slacks. But it felt different. She felt different. Today was her first day at the Caldwell Initiative. Her heart raced as she grabbed her bag and the folder James had given her. She glanced at her mother, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Sarah's face was pale, but her smile was warm. You look beautiful, sweetheart, her mother said softly. Mabel smiled back, though her nerves were still bubbling beneath the surface. Thanks, Mom. I'll be back later, okay? Don't forget to take your medicine. I won't, Sarah promised. And Mabel, I'm proud of you. Those words stayed with her as she stepped out of the apartment and into the crisp morning air. The Caldwell Initiative's office was nothing like the places Mabel was used to. The building was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the city skyline. As she walked through the glass doors, she felt a wave of intimidation. Everyone around her seemed so polished, so confident. But then she remembered Ethan's words. You're the strongest person I know. She straightened her shoulders and approached the receptionist, who greeted her with a warm smile. You must be Mabel, the woman said. Mr. Caldwell is expecting you. Let me show you to your desk. Mabel followed her through the open office space, her eyes taking in the bustling environment. People were typing away at computers, discussing projects and flipping through files. It was a world she had never been a part of, but one she was determined to learn. Her desk was small but tidy, with a computer and a stack of papers waiting for her. As she sat down, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. This was it, her chance to prove herself. The day passed in a blur of introductions and training sessions. Mabel met her team, a group of kind and supportive individuals who welcomed her with open arms. They explained the Foundation's mission, to provide resources and opportunities for underprivileged communities. Mabel listened intently, her mind racing with ideas. She had spent so much of her life on the other side of the equation, struggling, sacrificing, surviving. Now she had the chance to help others like her, to make a real difference. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but exhilarated. As she packed up her things, James appeared in the doorway of her office. How was your first day? He asked, leaning casually against the frame. Mabel hesitated, then smiled. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. You'll find your rhythm soon enough, I have no doubt about that. Mabel looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. Thank you, she said quietly, for giving me this chance. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm going to do my best. James stepped closer, his gaze steady. You don't have to prove anything to me, Mabel. I already know you're capable. Just focus on proving it to yourself. His words struck hard, and for the first time Mabel felt a flicker of confidence. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into her work. She learned quickly, asking questions and taking on every task with determination. Her past experiences gave her a unique perspective, and her ideas began to stand out in meetings. One day, during a team discussion about a new community project, Mabel spoke up. What if we partnered with local schools to provide after-school programs? A lot of kids don't have anywhere to go once classes end, and it could make a big difference. The room fell silent for a moment, and Mabel's stomach twisted. Had she said something wrong? But then James, who was sitting at the head of the table, smiled. That's an excellent idea, he said. Let's explore it further. Mabel's cheeks flushed, but she couldn't help the small smile that crept onto her face. As the weeks turned into months, Mabel began to see the impact of her work. She visited schools, met with families, and saw firsthand how the Foundation's efforts were changing lives. And in the process, she found herself changing too. She was no longer the invisible waitress blending into the background. She was Mabel, a woman with a voice, a purpose, and a future. The office was quiet, the hum of the city outside muffled by the thick glass windows. Mabel sat at her desk, finishing up the last of her reports for the day. The glow of her computer screen illuminated her face, and though she was tired, there was a sense of fulfillment in her work. It had been 3 months since she started at the Caldwell Initiative, and her life had changed in ways she never thought possible. Her mother's health was improving thanks to the insurance provided by her new job. Ethan was thriving in school, no longer worried about how they would make ends meet. And Mabel, she was finally starting to believe in herself. But there was one thing she hadn't expected: James Caldwell. At first, he had been just her boss, kind, supportive, but distant. He was a man of few words, always focused on the next project or meeting. Yet, over time, their interactions had shifted. It was in the small moments, the way he lingered after meetings to ask about her ideas, the way his gaze softened when he spoke to her, the way he seemed to notice things no one else did. Like tonight? You're still here, James's voice broke the silence, and Mabel looked up to see him standing in the doorway of her office. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Just finishing up. I wanted to make sure everything was ready for tomorrow's presentation. James stepped inside, his hands in his pockets. You've been working hard, Mabel. You should go home and rest. I will, she said, though she made no move to leave. James leaned against the edge of her desk, his presence both calming and unnerving. You've done incredible work these past few months, he said, his voice low. The Foundation is better because of you. Mabel felt her cheeks warm. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, and Mabel's heart began to race. She looked down at her hands, unsure of what to say. You know, James said after a pause, when I first met you, I saw someone who was strong but didn't realize it. Someone who had been through so much, but still kept going. Mabel glanced up, her eyes meeting his. And now? She asked softly. James smiled, a rare, genuine smile that made her chest tighten. Now I see someone who's not just strong but extraordinary. Someone who's making a difference, not just for herself, but for so many others. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing things like this, especially from someone like James. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, James replied. I just wanted you to know. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the world outside had faded away, leaving just the two of them. Finally, James straightened, his expression soft but serious. "Let me walk you out," he said. Mabel nodded, gathering her things and following him out of the office. The building was nearly empty, the lights dimmed for the night. As they stepped into the elevator, Mabel felt a strange mix of nervousness and calm. When they reached the lobby, James turned to her. "Mabel," he said, his voice hesitant for the first time. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I know this might be unprofessional, but I want to be honest with you. I admire you not just for your work, but for who you are. And I'd like to get to know you better outside of the office." Mabel's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Not from him. Not tonight. She began, but the words caught in her throat. James held up a hand, his expression gentle. "There's no pressure. I just wanted to say it. Whatever you decide, it won't change how much I respect you or the work you've done here." Mabel stared at him, her mind racing. She thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation at the party, the job offer, the months of hard work, and now, this. Finally, she smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I'd like that," she said softly. James's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, Mabel saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Good," he said, his voice warm. "Then let's take it one step at a time." As they stepped out into the cool night air, Mabel felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not just for her family or her future, but for herself. Mabel's life had changed in ways she never thought possible. What began as a night humiliation had turned into a journey of self-discovery, growth, and hope. Through her resilience and the kindness of someone who saw her potential, she found not only a new purpose, but also the possibility of love. Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for something better. Sometimes all it takes is one opportunity and the courage to take it. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if given a second chance?